So what you just heard was Mephisto Waltz No. 1 by Franz Liszt. He wrote this version around 1858, first for solo piano, later rewriting into 2 orchestra episodes. This piece was written during his Weimar period when he worked as a court Kapellmeister, a German word designating for the court music director who is responsible for all the music making. For Liszt, he served as a court composer and also an orchestra conductor, directing orchestra concerts and opera productions. At this time, Liszt was particularly interested in writing symphonic poems and promoting Wagner's operas. And he wrote a series of works, including his Dante and Faust symphonies, to actively structure his creative demonic power. German poet, philosopher Goethe described it as a spirit of active yet not entirely detrimental contradiction he thought he could detect in nature, something which manifested itself only in contradictions, and which therefore could not be comprehended under an idea, still less under one word. It was not godlike, nor human, nor devilish, nor angelic. It resembled chance. It was like providence. It seemed to penetrate all that limits us. It seemed to deal arbitrarily with the necessary elements of our existence. To this principle, which seemed to come in between all other principles and separate them, and yet link them together, I gave the name thematic. We are going to talk a bit more about the context here. Why Liszt wrote music with the title of Mephisto and how this fit into his life. Good evening, everyone. My name is Tzu-yi Chen. I'm a pianist and a doctoral candidate from the music department. Today, I'm going to present my dissertation in progress, and the topic is exile and return, a recurring theme of Franz Liszt in his life and music. Franz Liszt, born in 1811 and died in 1886, had an enormous impact on music as the foremost piano virtuoso of his time. He was the first pianist to give solo concerts in large concert halls. Before his time, people go to see a concert with a mixed program, including an orchestra overture, arias sung by singers, chamber music, or a piano concerto with orchestra following a symphony. Liszt pioneered the term piano recital still used today. He was also the first one playing a variety of repertoire ranging from Bach to his contemporaries, all from his memory. He even turned the piano facing the side of the podium so audience can watch his profile, his face, and his hands during the performance. Those are long-standing traditions established as after him. His concert reception equals the hysteria raised by a rock star of the 20th century. Imagine Jimi Hendrix. My dissertation starts from after I read Edward Said's reflections on exile and other essays. He described exile is the unhealable rift forced between a human being and a native place, between the self and its true home. My dissertation takes this rift, more appropriately this tension, as its starting point. Examine how the musical language of Franz Liszt responded to and expressed his experiences of exile and return. Liszt experienced exile and return in his travels, in his relationships, in emotional experiences, and in religious awakening and disillusionment. And I argue that his experience of exile uniquely served to influence his development as a pianist, as a composer, and as a Christian. Historian Lloyd Kramer explained, the concept of exile in Western culture goes back to Greek and Hebrew texts. Exile can mean separation from a geographical home or more broadly, separation from God. Liszt's lifelong struggle to reconcile his career, geographical home, and faith is evident in many letters he wrote to family, friends, and colleagues. For example, in one letter he wrote to a fellow musician, Liszt poured out his anguish about feeling rejected, writing, "Everyone is against me. Catholics because they find my church music profane. Protestant because to them my music is Catholic. Freemasons because they think my music is too clerical. To conservatives, I am a revolutionary. To the futurists, an old Jacobin. As for the Italian, in spite of Gambatti, if they support Garibaldi, they detest me as a hypocrite. If they are on the side of the Vatican, I'm accused of bringing the Venusberg into the church. To Barrett, I'm not a composer but a publicity agent. The Germans reject my music as French. The French as German. To the Austrian, I write gypsy music. To the Hungarians, foreign music. And the Jews loathe me, my music, and myself for no reason at all. The tension and conflict serve here a potent motif, informing an interesting pattern of duality brought about by his sense of belonging, his lifelong aspirations, his emotional conflicts, and his search for spiritual resolution. In my dissertation, Exile and Return serve as a binary model, a guide to interpret the duality of Liszt's life and music. This duality is manifest externally as well as internally, in his travels, in his relationships, in his desire to fulfill his musical vocation, and his spiritual return to his Christian faith. In a 1948 article, Musicology Tipo Shots presented Liszt's use of religious symbols in his musical composition as indicative of a spiritual duality, divine versus diabolical, and provide a list of embedded symbols in Liszt's B minor sonata and other works. Schatz divided Liszt's religious symbols into two main categories, the divine and the diabolical, and conclude that Liszt applied his religious symbol consistently. I suggest that Liszt turned to his inner spiritual life to provide the consistency and feeling of home that he lacked in his external circumstances. His spirituality was deeply rooted in the Roman Catholic faith, which influenced the type of religious symbols and the embedded program he used in his music. With Schatz study as a starting point of my research, I expand my musical analysis to 5 major piano works of Franz Liszt and intend to demonstrate that his duality is not only clearly reflected by his religious symbols in his music, but can also be found in other elements of his music, including his titles, extra musical references, embedded literary characters, literary text quotations, unique theatrical sound effects, and the use of thematic transformations to create programmatic musical narratives. So this was a program I played on February 16 in Paris. Moreover, I argue that these 5 works together which span 38 years of Liszt's life from 1839 to 1877 consistently express the tension that he felt between his Christian ideals and worldly temptation in many of his piano works, and that expression of this tension prevailed all over other forces in his life's journey. Additionally, Liszt traveled and relocated many times in his career, moving from his homeland Hungary to Paris, Austria, Switzerland, Italy, Weimar, and then Rome and Budapest. His many trips and geographical relocations also influenced these piano compositions. Through the analysis, I show how Liszt's departure and exile from his native land led to a physical and spiritual duality that ended with his return to his Roman Catholic faith. Liszt's lack of national identity in part stems from his complex family history. Liszt was born in Rading, Devozhan, a small town in present-day Austria near the border of Western Hungary in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. European was largely repartitioned after World War I, and the town, at that time still a small village, is now located in Lower Austria. So the purple one is the Burgenland where Rading is. So now you can see Rading in the Burgenland, and the right-hand side is Hungary. At the time of Liszt's birth, and the Habsburg monarchy had long ruled a vast territory of the Holy Roman Empire, including Liszt's native land, though the legal matters of Hungary always had to be considered separately due to the region's strong nationalistic sentiments. However, Franz Liszt was born into the servant class under the traditional monarchical sovereignty in the long history of the Holy Roman Empire. This meant that, following the tradition, his family had to stay loyal to their noble class masters. Liszt's predecessors were poor farming laborers, a part of the German-speaking migrant serf class whose work assignments depend on their land-owning overlords. Adapting to the Hungarian language, Franz Liszt's father, Adam Liszt, changed the family name from its original spelling of Liszt, L-I-S-T, a German surname, to Liszt, the Margarized spelling, L-I-S-Z-T. German was the language that Liszt's family spoke at home, and his father, Adam, never spoke proper Hungarian well enough to educate his son. Geographically, both father and son would be considered Austrian today, but because their land-owning master was a Hungarian noble prince who also did not speak Hungarian, they identified themselves as citizens of Kingdom of Hungary. 3 direct quotations from Liszt's own descriptions show the reason why his national identity has been a contested question. First, at his first public concert appearance in Pest in 1840, during his first tour back to Hungary after nearly 2 decades, Liszt proudly declared himself, "Je suis Hongrois," I am Hungarian. There is an irony there in that sentence, so full of patriotic emotion spoken while in Hungary, was uttered in French, since he spoke no Hungarian. Next, in his letter to his lover and long-term partner, Princess Caroline, in 1856, Liszt claimed, "I could be pretty well defined in German, zu einer Zigeuner, zu einer Franziskaner," translated as half gypsy, half Franciscan. What Liszt actually wanted to express by identifying himself partially gypsy was the freedom he desires as an artist and his yearning for the unknown expressed earlier in his letter. Lastly, being heavily engaged with music education in his late years, Liszt discussed his work at the Budapest Music Academy in a letter to his friend Baron Antal August in 1873. "I may well be allowed that, despite my deplorable ignorance of the Hungarian language, I will remain in my heart and mind Magyar from birth to the grave." In this case, Liszt's vague use of Magyar probably referred to the Hungarian people as a whole, without denoting and defining the subtle nuances of treating Magyar as a specific ethnic group. Now give a very short listen, about 1.5 minutes, about for his Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2. Just to make sure, did I share my computer sound correctly?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So from the example above, we observed that Liszt was not always precise in his word choices and moreover not consistent. He primarily focused on his motivations in his music, what compelled him to pursue his aspirations, and what inspired him to compose more music. But the most important is that his travel and his missions as a musician had taken him far away from his native land for so long that the definition of home had fundamentally changed. Most of Liszt's adulthood was spent outside of his Hungarian homeland, even though he claimed a national attachment to Hungary, but there was always a condition of alienation, which he developed after he spent some time living in foreign countries. Even upon his return to Hungary after many years abroad, Liszt felt he was a stranger in his own homeland. This estrangement was conditioned by the aspect of nation, culture, war, and faith, which have to be understood together with his biographical background. Because Liszt lacked a true sense of national belonging, his Catholic faith served as a stand-in or substitute for his homeland and provided him with a stability that his native country could not offer. Traditionally, the word exile denotes a person being forced to leave or who has been physically removed from the place or the community where he belongs. But it can also describe a permanent spiritual separation of being pulled away from God. According to Christian spirituality, believers can only return from this spiritual exile by confessing their sins and proclaiming their faith in God, who will then promise to reward them with everlasting life. Liszt, who at one time wanted to be a priest, was on his own in the world when his father died. By the 1830s, he entertained as a pianist among the upper class of Parisian salon, where he met Countess Marie d'Agoult, with whom he had 3 illegitimate children before their relationship strained and finally ruptured in 1844. Let's give a look how the Parisian salon looks like.
I'm David Collado. I chose a Spark Cash Card from Capital One because I earn unlimited 2% cash back on everything I buy. Last year, I redeemed $21,000 in cash back, which I used for new...
You see, every single one was throbbing for him. They knew perfectly well why I ran off with him.
For his teeth.
The tension Liszt experienced in this relationship and between his Christian ideal and worldly temptation continued to reflect in many of his piano works at this time. This tension was evident in Liszt's journal and diary. I felt 2 contrary forces within me. One thrusts me beyond all the heavens, the other pulls me down to the darkest region of death and non-existence. These 2 contrary forces are evident in the works conceived in this period, including his fragment Dantesque, which later he spent nearly 20 years to revise, reshape, and convert it to its final form entitled, after a reading of Dante, Fantasia quasi una sonata. In medieval times, religious monks debated over theological questions, such as how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. The medieval ear was also used to hearing perfect intervals, which are perfect fourth and perfect fifth. The augmented fourth or the diminished fifth, being halfway between the 2 most common pure intervals, was about the worst discord dissonant interval imaginable. The tritone was therefore labeled Diabolus in Musica, a forbidden interval banned from church music. No self-respecting church composer will ever write one anyway. However, Liszt boldly used this tritone octave right at the opening of this sonata to present this unprecedented tension. The application of tritone has a triple meaning here. We can relate this opening tritone motif to the Italian poet Dante Alighieri, who was exiled from Florence by the Catholic Church. We can also think of Dante's original words at the beginning of his poem, Nel mezzo da camin di nostra vita, mi ritrovai per una selva oscura, che la diritta via era smarrita, which translates midway in the journey of our life. I found myself within a dark forest, for the straight path was lost. A soul who was lost and condemned. This also implies the personal conflicts that Liszt felt within him at this time that mentioned in his journal. Now let's listen to the introduction and the exposition section of this sonata. We can hear this work bears a virtuosic and superhuman outlook and was largely written with the most inventive and astonished techniques. unconventional experiments with radical sonorities in two extreme sides of brilliance and darkness. Liszt wrote and rewrote this piece over nearly 2 decades. What I've played is the final version, published in 1858. In my research, I look at the range of versions and trace the changes he made, which could be the topic of its own dissertation, and focusing on the themes of exile, return in the evolution of this piece. The feature of opening tritone, his original idea, shown in the earliest manuscript in Goethe und Schiller Archive in Weimar, was preserved from the beginning through his revisions all the way to the last published version. In a later version, he revised the ending and designed a final return for the opening tritone interval. The ending of this 60 minutes long piece was resolved in perfect fifth, a church-favored interval. So the last line of this piece, it was resolved in perfect fifth. The exiled poet, the lost soul, the condemned interval were resolved and accepted by the church. Now we move on to talk about the piece you heard during the intermission. The first Mephisto Waltz was written soon after he completed the Dante Sonata. This is referred to as Liszt's middle period between 1848 to 1860. Mephisto Waltz is inspired by the poem Faust, ein Gedicht, written by Austro-Hungarian poet Nikolaus Lenau. Liszt took only a fragment to depict a wedding scene that Mephisto disguised as a hunter in this episode, and Faust enter and celebrate together with the guest. By the time he wrote his first Mephisto Waltz, Liszt had already mastered his inventive technique called Thematic Transformation to capture the atmosphere and the essence of the poem. In brief, Liszt used thematic transformation as a compositional method and tool to substitute the traditional form, which provides a conventional way of listening and expectation. Liszt assigned a designated character or mood to the theme that is initially tentative. While the music progressed, the character began to modify or expand into different moods. For example, the theme can start from a merrily dancing character, moving to hypnotic, amorphous, hesitant, seductive, voluptuous, sinister, to even stormy and decisive, so on and so forth. The transformation of mood and character give an action which tells its listener how the plot is moving. Liszt went further and beyond to create the second or even the third thematic materials and had them serve as a contrasting theme, so themselves also subjected to transformations. This process of maturation in his compositional technique came as he took residency at the Weimar court between 1847 and 1860. In 1847, he met Princess Caroline von Wittgenstein, another married noblewoman and a devout Catholic. Liszt quickly established another home with her in Weimar. Right from the beginning of their controversial relationship, the princess sought to annul her first marriage through the church. But the case was suspended due to the intervention by her husband's family. For 12 years, Liszt and Princess Caroline lived as lovers in Weimar. Their unmarried status and Caroline's illegal escape from her first marriage made the couple unwelcome in this Protestant city. Establishing liaisons with this married woman stained Liszt's reputation, and his relationship remained largely unacceptable in both society and the church. Liszt recognized and admitted to Caroline in his late life that the weakness in his character lies in woman. His Don Juan image, his devilish virtuosic technique, and his busy touring schedule attract women everywhere he went, and for him represented a spiritual exile, pulling him away from his religious beliefs. Liszt related those personal and external conflicts to his imagined literary characters and expressed his feelings on a borrowed topic. He assigned his musical themes with characters such as Faust and Mephistopheles, gave them actions by transforming the themes into different moods and colors. Princess Caroline and Liszt went to Rome and in 1861 sought to legally marry through the Roman Catholic Church. The Pope, initially willing to hear Caroline's case, later changed his position due to intense political pressure from Princess Caroline's family members. Thus, the wedding ceremony was postponed and never took place. This spurred Liszt to remain in Rome, and from 1861 to 1869, he renewed his connection to his Catholic beliefs, even living in a monastery and participating in its regular church services. In 1865, Liszt received the minor orders of the Catholic Church. During this period, he also refocused his efforts on deep research into the musical tradition of the Roman Catholic Church. His compositions in this period are inspired by early Renaissance music, by the beauty and simplicity of music, by its main proponents such as Palestrina. He participated in the reform movement of the Catholic Church, the Sicilian Reform movement, which upheld the idea of sacred music with little or no instrumental accompaniment, a revival of Gregorian chant and a homophonic style of choral writing. Based on these elements, now you are going to hear the Fountains of Villa d'Este, which he wrote in 1877. In this piece, we hear a shift away from the beginning with conflicts as with the earlier pieces. We can hear the water shimmery both in Liszt's color choices and in the piece's vaporous running passages. This piece is a forerunner of the later Impressionist water music type. For Liszt, the symbolism of water is not the same as for Impressionist composers who interpreted purely based on color and movement. In the center of this piece, Liszt quotes a verse taken from the Gospel of St. John, which points directly to God's salvation and his promise of eternal life. But the water that I shall give him shall become in him a well of water springing up into eternal life. And the text quoted in the music. Besides, the Trinity described as three substances, water, vapor, and ice painted in this music. He also constructed his main theme with intervals in thirds. One of the abstract idea debated by medieval monks and clergymen was that there was a true representation in music of the Holy Trinity. It was, of course, the musical interval produced by adding three pure tones, representing the three in one. So the main theme is constructed by interval thirds. Let's give a listen. The images are from Rome, Villa d'Este. As an international reputed concert pianist and composer, Liszt traveled widely during his lifetime. His trips and geographical relocation from Hungary to Austria, Paris, Switzerland, Italy, Weimar, Rome, and Budapest were influential voyages and returns that inevitably and arguably influenced his piano compositions. These influences and life experience first appeared as external factors they internalized in Liszt's innermost being and inspired him. As a result, each of the 5 selected piano works bears and reflects a specific tension and resolution in his musical language. Thank you very much. Going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Tzu-yi. So we have time for questions if anyone has any questions. I have a tough one if no one, or maybe it's not a tough one if anybody else doesn't know. So how would you say that your interpretation of Liszt's life and your knowledge of his life shapes how you play his music?
That's a good question. Actually, I think one of the committee members, she wants to ask the same question as you. So, during his life, first I answer Linda's question. So, I felt through this research, it brought me through 2 different stages because, as you could see, his compositions are all highly virtuosic and very technical. So at first, it seems like all this massive background information has nothing to do with the technical aspect because there will be a totally different part that I have to realize how to play, just physically and technically, how to get the sound, how to make the connections with the physical aspect and also to my mind. So that's about the piano performance practice aspect. And that's the first stage when I'm learning this piece. Through the research, I understood Liszt was not a conventional composer musician. He is very emotional and all his compositions derived from his feelings and emotions. And that's why when he turned from virtuosic pianist to serious composer, the first thing he thought was, all the classical conventional form don't fit me. Because he was born in 1811, that's the end of the classical era. Beethoven died in 1822, and eventually starting from 19th century after Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, it's a new era. And he felt he need to find a form to be much more personalized so his emotion and motivation can unfold without worrying about when I need to put the theme to return, when I need to develop and to respect all the proper proportion as the idea of enlightenment in 18th century about balance, harmony, and proportion. For him, it doesn't work that way. So he invented new form as through a few different ways. He borrowed literary influences as how he observed in poetry, how he see the character was given and the conflicts was worked out in the novel or in the poetry. He took that in his music. Also, he worked out, he invented new techniques, thematic transformation is how I briefly described. It's actually one theme, but given so many different characters, and when listener first hear it in a piece, they won't be able to say that's the same thing because the characters are so different. You just will think, oh, that's something totally different, but actually it's one material, and that's him. He wrote all these characters under him, this big umbrella. So when I understand this, the way when I work my piece will be a different approach from the first approach I took. The first approach I took just as a pianist, but then I need to take another approach as a composer to trace another way, another end back, to really assign the character everywhere when there's atmosphere change or something that I need to know exactly. There is like actor, actress took a plot, a theatrical text of Shakespeare, but then has not just memorizing all the text and the technique of acting, but to really live within him or herself the emotions. And that's the hard part. You basically have to recreate and refeel his feelings. And because this is a very specific him, so I think that helped me to interpret that sometimes if we just take the same approach as being a pianist, you repeat, and you can be just one approach. And you kind of, once you repeat your emotion so many times, you basically don't feel at all, there's no emotion. And that's a hard part that will inspire me, because, and that's the way how I kind of work through this program, starting to be a little bit different. Despite hard practicing, I will need to have a separate time from piano, as if I took walk or I just be away from piano, but be in my mind and with my heartbeat or something to kind of live through this emotion, to make sure, imagine this 1 hour, how my heartbeat, how my feeling would go as an actor, actress. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that totally, it's funny that you ended with actor and actress, because it made me think that what you were talking about before that just was like the very definition of performance, right? You're not just playing it, you really are performing. So Sam had a question. I don't know if you want to repeat it, Sam, or you put it, I know Tzu-yi saw it in the chat.
Yeah, so Liszt was, not only during his lifetime was he known as a performer or composer, better known as one or the other, but also now, what is he? What do kind of people looking back think he was more innovative as?
So this is another very conflicting and very interesting thing in him. So he kind of knows very well about this world and what the world looks for. So he knows his early years, all these very innovative and radical pianist and technical programs are the one which people kind of remember and will keep playing on the stage. When he turned to be composer, and especially when he turned to be religious and wrote a lot of church music, he knew. He told his friends saying, those music, I'm not going to actively promote them. People might understand or they might not understand, and I am fine with it. And he knew, and because he knew that's like his own solitude, his own reflection, his own calling about how he interprets religious music, his church music. And through the 19th century, the whole power of church is actually drastically going down. And actually people don't really think a revival church music is such an important thing. There are more important things to be worried about. There are so many revolutions. Every 15 years, there is something. So people basically do not have a peaceful life. And you can say at his late life, the letters, right, I pull out right at the beginning, that he actually suffered this rejection. He knew what's going on. The world is kind of falling into pieces, and Europe was not old Europe anymore. It's forming a new Europe. And it's the new order still not taking place yet, and it's a lot of this fighting and a lot of different sentiments. And then so he was kind of in between, and he understood that, but he said he could wait. So it's like the scholarship and a lot of people actually in the 20th century and 21st century went back to find his long life, how many things he had done, and all these different phase of his life. He pour his energy to live out his experiences as to the fullest, that no one has this much energy as him. So yeah, and so right now, as he's most memorable as a pianist composer because he's a genius pianist, and all the technique he just invented so many things. Like when you saw I play in Dante Sonata, there's a interchangeable octave. All these technique, he was the first one who wrote that. So there are so many innovative things that people would not even think piano can be played like that. So he won his name as Paganini on piano. Does that answer?
Yeah, I like that Paganini on the piano. That's a good way to put it.
And Spencer, I think was it your hand that was up, or did I saw some other question?
No.
No. Okay.
I
Sorry.
hit the wrong button.
Oh, sorry. My bad. Okay. So I just want to, Angela put a comment in the question that is just perfect. It's always wonderful to try and pull things together, and that there's a way to pull together two seemingly so disparate topics. Right? Sam's presentation made me think of the identity of water is constantly changing and in motion, like Liszt's shifting identity and metaphorical molecular composition, if you will. So who knew we'd be able to find some kind of connection between the pieces. Any other questions? We're a little bit over time.
I really liked the quote from Dante from the beginning of the Inferno. Yeah, that quote has always stuck with me over the years. So I didn't know Liszt was inspired by that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That's
So,
kind of fascinating. Yeah.